This PowerPoint will address the background of the English Reformation, which I think is one of the most interesting, just absolutely fascinating stories in all of European history. The English Reformation is a very complex story of a political reformation, and it starts out simply enough. There was a king, Henry VIII, son and successor of King Henry VII, who, as we saw in the previous unit, had come to power after the War of the Roses and established the Tudor dynasty and went on to have a pretty successful reign as king, and he's one of our great examples of the new monarchs. King Henry VIII had a more difficult reign, I guess I would say, than his father. And the story of the Reformation comes from the fact that he needed a son, okay? King Henry VIII, in order to secure his dynasty, wanted a male heir, a male child. Sounds simple enough, right? It should have been easy for himself as king to secure this request, but it ended up not being such an easy thing at all for many, many reasons. King Henry VIII was not raised to be king. He was the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth Woodville. So his elder brother was raised to be king. His older brother's name was Arthur, and he, however, was kind of a sickly child, whereas Henry was very robust and healthy. He was a great hunter. He was a great athlete and very handsome, quite a favorite of the ladies and the men alike. And not in a romantic way, of course, but he was a great buddy, and people enjoyed his company and liked to be with him. He was kind of a popular guy, larger than life. He was physically a very big man and had quite a large personality. He was also devoutly Catholic, and when the Reformation started in continental Europe with the Diet of Worms and Luther's break with the church, Henry had already become king. He was so devoutly Catholic that he had considered a life in the church, and was highly likely that until he had to become king that he would have pursued that path. But becoming king, of course, he did not. So as king, when it came to Catholicism, he had no patience for Luther or Martin Luther's reforms or any of that. And he wrote an essay in which he condemned Luther as a heretic and defended the sanctity of the church and the office of the papacy. And for this effort, Pope Clement VII issued him the title, the Defender of the Faith. So I'm a great lover of irony in history, and Henry ending up bringing the Reformation to England, this great Catholic monarch, this defender of the faith, is certainly a great irony in history. Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's first wife. He very notoriously married 6 times, and she was his first spouse and his longest tenured spouse, if you will. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, and she came to England as a young princess to marry Arthur, the heir to the throne of England, and she brought with her an incredibly large dowry of gold. Now, shortly after their wedding, Arthur passed away. He died. He was quite sick at the time of their wedding, and King Henry VII, who was still alive at the time, he knew he was essentially buying some time here, and he had hoped that Arthur would live long enough to father a child who would then join the line of succession, would become the heir to the throne, but he did not. And upon Arthur's death, Catherine of Aragon insisted that the marriage had not been consummated, and which means, of course, that they had had sexual intercourse following taking their vows. Now, usually these things, for such an important marriage, there would have had to be a public witness to it. Well, none of the witnesses could confirm the consummation, and Catherine insisted that it had never happened. This poor girl was poked and prodded and examined by physicians, and she was kept in England until it could be determined whether or not she was carrying a child, which of course she was not, because all the evidence suggested that she was telling the truth, and the marriage had never been consummated. Well, she could have returned to Spain upon then. She was still a young lady, probably around 19 years old or so, and have been free, of course, to marry again. But Henry VII didn't want to send her back to Spain, because if he sent her back to Spain, he would have to return her dowry of all of that Spanish gold. And he certainly didn't want to do that. So, solution at hand, marry Catherine of Aragon to the younger brother. They got a dispensation from the Pope that said the marriage with Arthur had never happened. And Catherine of Aragon was married to Henry, who was now the heir to the throne and was probably 5 or 6 at the, well, always, but probably 14 or 15 years old at the time. So he's about 5 years younger than Catherine. It was, by all accounts, a happy marriage. Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII were married for a couple of decades. She was beloved by Henry and beloved by the people. She was considered beautiful and kind and pious and generous, and was greatly popular with the people of England. She gave birth 6 times during her marriage to Henry VIII, but unfortunately only one of those children lived. One of the very sad realities of the time, very high child mortality rate, and only one of those children, a daughter, survived past the age of 5. That daughter was Mary, went on to become Princess Mary, and eventually the Queen Mary. Henry VIII was always a man of great passions, passion for sport and passion for food and passion for drink and, of course, passion for women. And while he, by all accounts, loved Catherine very much, he always had many mistresses. And one of those mistresses, not Anne Boleyn, but another one of his mistresses, at some point gave birth to a son who lived. And this is really what gets Henry considering very seriously his need for a male heir. And this is where Anne Boleyn enters the picture. Anne Boleyn was a very intelligent, very beautiful young lady. She was the daughter of a British aristocrat who was most interested in advancing his own interests and prestige at the English court, and used, quite frankly, both of his daughters as a means to do that. And so he kind of very intentionally put his very young, very beautiful, very intelligent daughter in front of the king with the intention of having her become the king's mistress. It was in order to secure the family's fortunes there. But Anne Boleyn wasn't interested in being the king's mistress. She absolutely bewitched the king. He fell head over heels in lust with her and eventually in love with her. But she refused to be his mistress. She played a nice game of hard to get, if you will, and she insisted she wanted to be his wife, that she was the woman that he loved and he should therefore marry her. And she spoke often of the sons, all the sons that she could provide for the king, which Queen Catherine would not be able to do. She was becoming too old by this point. She was getting beyond her childbearing years. And so she talked often of all the sons she would give him. Very importantly, Anne Boleyn was a very educated woman, and she had been exposed to the writings of Luther and others, and was a bit of a closet Protestant herself. She was really interested in Protestant ideas, and her exposure, especially to Luther's work, would become important and influential later on. Well, the king was in love with Anne Boleyn. His wife, Catherine, was too old to provide him with a child. Most likely at this time, that was becoming a very unlikely avenue of finding this son. And he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and he entrusted making all of this happen to Cardinal Wolsey, who was his secretary and kind of his right-hand man, very close advisor to him at the time. And Cardinal Wolsey took up what became known as the King's Great Matter, how to legally allow Henry VIII to marry Anne Boleyn so she could produce a legitimate male heir for him. Now, the easiest thing in the path of least resistance would have been to have Catherine of Aragon retire to a convent, retire and become a nun essentially in her later years. And this was not unheard of, especially for the members of royal families, for kings, etc. Men could continue to father children and late into their middle age, etc. But women reached a point where they could no longer have children. And therefore, to enable kings and other important men to marry again, it was a pretty common practice to have a wife retire. I know this sounds very, very strange to us. And Wolsey went to Catherine with this, and he was essentially like, look, this is what you need to do. And Catherine of Aragon, who had always been very humble, very meek, and very obedient to her husband and to the other men, and kind of surprised everybody by refusing to step down, refusing to go to a convent. This deeply pious, deeply Catholic woman, she refused to step aside and allow another person to take her place. This gave Cardinal Wolsey a headache, to say the least, because now accomplishing the King's Great Matter would become a much more difficult task. And the only other thing that he could do, given that Henry VIII in England, got the Catholicism here, was he had to seek an annulment. He wanted this marriage, he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, he wanted any of her children to be legitimate, and in order for that to happen, they had to be married. So he goes to the Pope, Cardinal Wolsey goes to Rome to seek out an audience with Pope Clement VII and secure an annulment for the king. This ended a little bit disastrously for Cardinal Wolsey and Henry VIII. Pope Clement VII would have been more than happy to give his British monarch, his defender of the faith, anything that he wanted, including an annulment. Okay, so it's tempting. I always think about, like, gosh, poor Catherine. But this is all about politics, right? It's about politics, and it's about religion. It's about keeping England in the church. It's about maintaining Henry as a defender of the faith. But it just turned out that the Pope wasn't in a position to grant this annulment. This guy over here is the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whom we have met before, the most powerful man in the world, the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. So let's all think about this for a minute. Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Charles V is their grandson, which means that he is her nephew. And knowing for so many months what was coming, that Henry VIII and Wolsey were wanting to get rid of her, she had written letter after letter after letter to her nephew to beg his protection. And it just so conveniently happened that at this time, okay, the Pope was the prisoner of Charles V. Now, this is because of a state of war that existed between Charles V and the King of France, which we will talk about on another day. But suffice it to say, the Pope, as the prisoner of Charles V, was not allowed to grant the annulment, and he sent Wolsey back to England with bad news for the king. So, the King's Great Matter remained up in the air, and time was of the essence. Protestant sentiment was growing in England. There was a significant amount of kind of social, I don't want to say unrest, but let's say buzz about all of this. Wolsey's enemies on the King's Privy Council and those who favored Protestantism kind of saw their opportunity to pounce and get rid of Wolsey. Anne Boleyn, who was becoming fearful of the king losing interest in her, was really kind of sensing a matter of urgency in moving all of this forward, okay? And she encouraged Henry VIII to go around the Pope. Remember, she liked Luther. She was really influenced by his ideas and whatnot. And she said to Henry, "Who is this Pope to tell you, the King of England, that you can't do what you want in terms of your own marriages?" And sensing again, not wanting this time in the sense of urgency and not wanting the king to lose interest in her, she had become his mistress and had become pregnant. And this kind of brought everything, put everything on the table. Things were going to have to happen. Wolsey was arrested for treason for his failure in the annulment and in winning the king's great matter. Anne Boleyn was with child and eagerly awaited becoming the Queen of England. Catherine of Aragon was sent into retirement out in the country, and King Henry VIII went to Parliament to seek his annulment through their means, through other means, and the Reformation came to England.